Good morning and welcome to the fourth meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. We've received apologies from Evelyn Tweed and Emma Roddick. And also, before we begin, can I ask those taking part to please turn their electronic devices to silent. Before we begin, can we consider whether to take item 3 in private? Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. Our next item of business today is a roundtable on the implementation of the Deer Working Group recommendations. And we're joined this morning by 9 stakeholders and we have up to 2 hours for our discussions. As you can see, we have quite a few participants this morning, so I can ask everybody to be succinct in their questions and their answers. If you could just indicate to the clerk or myself if you wish to take part at any point. There's no expectations for everyone to answer every question, so don't feel that you need to contribute if your point has already been covered. Likewise, if you feel that a part of a discussion doesn't relate to your area of expertise, don't feel that you need to participate at that point. So we're just going to get everybody to introduce themselves. So I'm Finlay Carson, convener in MSP for Galloway and West Dumfries.
Grant, Highlands and Islands MSP.
Richard Cook, Scottish Venison.
Emma Harper, South Scotland MSP.
Duncan O'Ewing, convener of Link Deer Group and head of species and land management at RSPB Scotland.
Tom Turnbull, the chair of the Association of Deer Management Groups.
Ariane Burgess, MSP for the Highlands and Islands region.
David Fleetwood, Director of Policy for the Drummuir Trust.
Donald Fraser from Nature Scot.
Lee McNally, Scottish Gamekeepers Association.
Tim Eagle, Highlands and Islands MSP.
Malcolm Coombe, Senior Lecturer at the University of Strathclyde, and I was an external examiner to the Deer Working Group. External advisor, I keep using that one word, sorry.
Alana Wetham, MSP for Carrickmillock and Doon Valley.
Ross Ewing, Director of Moorland at Scottish Land and Estates.
Beatrice Wishart, MSP for Shetland, where there are no deer.
It's some level of success.
Graham Press, Director of Land Management and Regions for Forestry and Land Scotland.
So, good morning. You're most welcome. Can I just remind you, you don't need to operate the mics. The operator there is very good at seeing who's wanting to speak and will turn their mic on for you. So, I'll kick off with a very broad question. I would like to hear your views on the impact of the current deer densities in Scotland and touch on the effects on the economy and environmental issues. Now, I was always told when I got elected from my dear friend, my late friend, Alec Ferguson, that there was 2 things I had to avoid as an MSP, and that was deer management and land reform. Well, I've managed to avoid land reform in this session, but certainly we're in it deer again, and deer density was always something that was one of the most important topics. So I'll open it up to the floor, and anyone would like to kick off this morning? Duncan and then Tom.
Yeah, so the current populations of deer in Scotland are estimated at over 1 million animals. So that is, their population has doubled in the past 20 years. When it comes to environmental impact, the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy is emphasising that we need to reduce deer densities across Scotland to under 2 deer per square kilometre in priority woodland habitats, 5 to 8 deer per square kilometre in the Cairngorms National Park, and 10 per square kilometre across the rest of Scotland. In reality, though, and given that many of us who are trying to manage deer sustainably on our properties, we require lower deer densities than 10 per square kilometre in the neighbouring environment. So, reasonably, you're probably looking at under 5 per square kilometre across Scotland. Many of us suffer from deer incursions when we're trying to manage deer populations to sustainable levels in line with government policy.
Can I ask, what reason do you control deer numbers? What are you protecting?
So we're largely, well, a number of things. I mean, we are engaged with peatland restoration, so we need low deer populations to prevent trampling. and damage to the public investment that's gone into peatland restoration. We're also trying to achieve woodland expansion, native woodland expansion, in line with Scottish Government targets. And if you don't have low deer densities in those circumstances, then you're not going to deliver native woodland expansion without fences. So, yeah, and obviously, you know, the benefits that come from that management include biodiversity. So this is really a cross-cutting issue with major benefits to, you know, a wide variety of public interests. I'm not even touching on the public benefits like reducing road traffic accidents and reducing Lyme disease as well.
Thank you. Tom.
Thank you. I think there's no doubt that deer do affect peatland restoration, woodland creation and existing woodlands. But I think it shouldn't be lost that, particularly in the Highlands, there have been reductions in deer numbers. I think the Highlands are perhaps the only area of the UK where there have been reductions in deer numbers. They're closely monitored by Nature Scott. At an average across the Highlands, they're already below that 10 deer per square kilometre, which is referred to within the Deer Working Group report. I believe they're at 9.3 deer per square kilometre. And this year, or 2023-24, there was the highest cull of deer taken in Scotland since Nature Scott have been recording since back in 1996. So I think the direction of travel is clear, but obviously in some areas, some work will need to be done. I think it also shouldn't be lost that those deer are an important economic benefit as well to rural communities and to employment. And I think that's something that we've been hearing increasingly of late, because we've been doing a lot of work talking to stalkers and deer managers, and there are fears out there about the impacts of reducing deer numbers as well. So it is a balancing act that's required.
Okay, thank you. Graham.
Okay, thank you. So as we manage 9% of Scotland, obviously the biggest land manager in Scotland, and we cull around about 43,000 deer a year, which is about a third of the recorded annual cull in Scotland. So with that, we've also been doing thermal imaging in terms of looking at incursions into the land we manage, and we do have quite a number of areas across Scotland still where we're doing a good level of cull, but because of incursion, we're getting deer in from areas of higher deer densities. So the impact, has been said already, is across the whole of Scotland, and you can't look at it on an individual property. It's looking at the whole landscape and how deer don't respect ownership. They look at the work across the whole landscape. So in terms of the question about the impact of deer densities, yeah, our target is between 2 and 5 per square kilometre. And there's lots of evidence to show that you need, if you're going to get, say, particularly natural regeneration of trees, habitat restoration, protect peatland, it needs to be at that sort of level. And we ourselves know we've got further to go to achieve that. And across Scotland, that is a big, as has been said already, a big cross-cutting impact in terms of deer numbers and impact on the natural environment.
Thank you. Ross.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Committee. I think it's really important that when we're having a discussion around deer impacts that we don't characterise the problem as a national one. So Duncan mentioned there 1 million deer across Scotland. A lot of people would dispute that figure, but also I think it's really important that we don't talk about national figures when discussing deer impacts. Nature Scott, who are obviously the subject matter experts on this, actually characterised talking about 1 million deer as misleading and unhelpful. And I think it's really important that we kind of frame our discussion around local impacts and regional impacts of deer as opposed to characterising it as some sort of national problem, because I don't think that is the case. I do think we need to be cognizant of other factors beyond just the management of deer. So deer are doing better in Scotland, if you like, as a result of woodland expansion, which has been characterised in the Deer Working Group as a dominant factor when it comes to expanding the range of deer. But we also need to acknowledge as well that the climate is warming, and a scientific study published in 2017 by Albin and others said that climate warming has seen earlier springs, longer growing season, and hence higher plant productivity, as well as more benign winters, all of which should enhance birth rates and survival. So this isn't simply a question around management intervention. There are other factors here that are expanding the deer range in Scotland and ultimately resulting in increased reduced densities in some localities, and I do think we need to be cognizant of that. The final thing I would say, Convener, on this as well is that, and Tom has touched on it there is a differential situation across Scotland. In the Highlands, there is deer management which is occurring collaboratively at the landscape scale, predominantly through deer management groups. It is a different situation in the Lowlands, where predominantly we're relying on recreational deer stalkers to do the management. And of course, in the Lowlands of Scotland as well, you don't have such large land holdings, contiguous land holdings. They tend to be smaller, and you have more of them. So there are distinct challenges across Scotland which make it very difficult to, I suppose, come up with a national solution to some of this. But I do think it's really important that we don't just talk about the management interventions and actually acknowledge some of the other things that are resulting in the expansion of deer range in Scotland.
Thank you. I've got David and then Donald.
Thank you. You asked about the impact, and I guess a couple of stats I might add to illustrate a little bit of that. I think we would focus perhaps less on the kind of absolute number and more on the ability of the habitats we're looking at to recover and rebound. Carbon from peatlands and from natural woodland, two of the subjects that Duncan and others have referred to. 80% of our peatlands are degraded. They can't regenerate fast enough because of deer trampling. That's evidence put forward by the Scottish Government itself. And native woodland cover is currently only at around 4% and cannot regenerate and colonise because of deer eating young saplings. So I think it gives a little bit of a sense of the scale of some of the issue that we're trying to tackle and the impact that has on outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. Thanks.
Thank you. Donald.
Yes, thank you. I think it's important to look at the context in which we're operating now as well, in looking at biodiversity and climate crisis. So the outcomes that we are looking from deer management have changed over time as well, and looking for that enhancement, improvement in condition. So it's important that we're looking at that context in terms of deer management now. The challenges around understanding population and impacts across Scotland, and a lot of work has been done on that. Graham's mentioned the kind of technology that's now available for doing that. The methods that we're using are improving in doing that. The data collection ability that we have now has improved in terms of the online aspects that we're able to do. So there's a lot more and better information that's being collected now around impacts on populations, which improves the kind of decision making that we can take on deer management in Scotland.
Thank you. Just before I bring Duncan in, we heard about landscape scale management, but we've also heard about encroachment and competing priorities. So how can or how significant is the conflict between different land managers for different outcomes? Is that a big issue? Duncan and then Tom.
I'll respond to that in a minute, but just to come back on Ross's point, in the Scottish Government response to the Deer Working Group report, it made it clear, the Scottish Government made it clear that deer populations and densities are important factors, as well as David has said, considering the damage aspects, which can happen to a variety of public interests as described. And just to remind the committee that, we've had 7 inquiries over 80 years into deer populations in Scotland. All, pretty well without exception, have come to the same conclusion, that deer populations in Scotland are too high. And I quote from 1989, the chair of the Red Deer Commission at that stage, when the population of deer in Scotland was estimated to be 300,000 animals, said the deer population was too high at that stage. I mean, we've moved on significantly since then. In response to your point, Chair, yes, it is very difficult if you are wanting to grow trees and to do peatland restoration, if you are sitting next to an estate that is trying to manage high deer populations, particularly for sporting stags for clients to shoot. I mean, if you have an estate neighbouring which is maintaining deer populations in the 20s to 30s of deer per square kilometre, as can be the case, I'm not saying that's across all of Scotland, it is almost impossible to achieve your objectives without deer fencing, which comes, of course, at a cost to the public purse. It is the public that pays for deer fencing to separate competing interests. So ideally, you want deer populations reduced across the whole landscape so everybody can help fulfil their objectives.
Tom.
Thank you. You asked about collaboration, which is what our organisation tries to facilitate. Our members cover about 3 million hectares of the highlands. It's only largely the highlands. They are of competing intentions often. It might be environmental, agricultural, sporting, forestry. And the challenge is to get people to have a conversation around deer management on a landscape scale, which is vital, as has already been alluded to. Historically, we have had challenges doing that, but I think recently there's been a huge step forward in some of the work undertaken by the Common Ground Forum. I think we're able to discuss these challenges far better through mediation and now through other methods. And I think what's important is we're starting to hear the voices of the deer managers themselves, the people on the ground who have to undertake this work in very challenging conditions, day after day through winter. So collaboration isn't straightforward. I think it's becoming better. In reaction to some of what Duncan said, I think it's increasingly unusual to find a purely sporting estate. Most estates or land holdings would like to leave the ground in a better condition than they found it. Most land holdings are undertaking tree planting or thinking about peatland restoration if they haven't done it already. So things are changing. Deer numbers are coming down in the highlands. The million deer figure is an estimation because we don't know how many deer there are in our woodlands across large parts of Scotland. So deer management is a challenge, and it's nuanced depending on the landscape that you're operating in.
Thank you. Richard.
Thank you, Convener. Could I just add to what Tom said, that in the red deer range and among the 50 deer management groups, there is a very structured approach to deer management. They all have deer management plans. They all have the deer management plans all set out the objectives of the different parties concerned. They develop a population model which reflects the requirements of each member of the deer management group, and there's a negotiated compromising process in establishing what those population models are to deliver a certain level of cull. So I think it's important to stress that the management of red deer in the highlands is not just a haphazard process. It's a very structured process, and it's also a voluntary process. So all the people who sit around that table, including people right across the spectrum, from those who want 2 per square kilometre to those who want 10, sit down in a spirit of cooperation in almost all cases and arrive at a compromise that delivers the best balanced outcome for all interests. And in a sense, that is what the approach of the Common Ground Forum is beginning to try and introduce on a broader national spectrum.
I think we're straying into a territory that Emma Harper's going to explore. So I'm going to ask Emma to come in with her question, and I'll bring in those I've indicated.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Good morning to everybody. So it's kind of what you're talking about as far as the structures and how we manage deer. Can everybody tell us, how do we manage deer currently in Scotland, and is it different in the Highlands versus in the South West, for instance? And I'm looking at Richard first because you started that ball rolling.
Well, I'm probably not the best person to answer that. You should probably direct the question to Tom, but just to introduce it by saying that it varies very much depending on circumstance and species. Ross alluded to this. The different approaches are wide and the people who do it are wide, but I think I should defer to Tom on that question.
Thank you. Yes, there are, in the Highlands, there are 50 deer management groups covering the vast majority of the Highlands, perhaps 90% of the Highlands. Those groups, has already been stated, have publicly available deer management plans in place. They have 5-year population models. They regularly count their deer, sometimes with the help of Nature Scott and their helicopter counts. Increasingly, people are using thermal counting to monitor their populations. The population models that are put in place, whilst not imposed by Nature Scott, are agreed by Nature Scott, and there are Nature Scott representatives at every single meeting of every single deer management group. It can be challenging, as I've already mentioned, and opposing objectives can create challenges. Sometimes that's more personalities than objectives as well. But there is quite a structured approach in the Highlands, and I think it was regularly brought up in the Deer Working Group report that there is a less structured approach in the Lowlands. As Ross alluded to, there are smaller land holdings, more fractured land holdings. Increasingly, leases are used for deer management, so that people are travelling, sometimes considerable distances to undertake deer management across the lowlands. We don't have an idea of what the population is, and we also have less of an idea about what the culls are as well, whereas, as was evidenced in the Deer Working Group report, the red deer cull is pretty well recorded to NatureScot every year.
I've got Ross and then Graham.
So to come back on your question, Ms Harper, around the lowland side of things. So the way it generally works in the lowlands, as kind of Tom's alluded to there, is that the stalking arrangements tend to be much more informal than they are perhaps in the uplands of Scotland. So what I mean by that is that you generally have trained recreational deer stalkers undertaking stalking in their own time for their own enjoyment. And there's a number of motivations for that. Obviously, there's the sporting side, but quite often people are also motivated by the venison side of things as well. Sometimes it's the prevention of agricultural damage too, which is features quite strongly. But the arrangements are informal. As Tom said, generally what you have is kind of an annual rolling lease, and you might have one or a group of stalkers known as a syndicate who will generally partake in deer stalking in a lowland context. So just to draw on my own experience, because I do this myself, there's a couple of permissions I have in Perthshire where I pay a small amount of money every year to basically be able to go out and take a certain number of deer from these particular properties. I mainly eat all of that myself, but some of it will go to the game dealer as well. I suppose to flag what I think is a real issue in the lowland context at the moment is the lack of community infrastructure when it comes to deer management. So in particular, I'm talking about larder facilities and chillers. I'm very fortunate that I have access to a community deer larder near Dunkeld, which is absolutely fantastic. But a lot of people don't have that access. And if you don't have access to the infrastructure to process the venison, then you're actually not going to be able to execute the management of deer that you might want. I'm very fortunate. I've shot 10 bucks this year, 10 roebucks and 10 roe does. So I'm doing okay this year. But I could probably shoot a lot more than that if there was greater availability of infrastructure. And I imagine a lot of other lowland stalkers are in a similar position to myself on that.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly come on to more of the detail on that a little bit later on. Graham.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we're a member, I think, of every deer management group in Scotland, given our extensive land holdings. So we've got a lot of experience, and there's a big variation. I think that's been inferred already today by most people. So that the range of success and commonality objectives does vary greatly around the Highlands. I think everyone would agree with that. If you're looking at an area where it has had particular success in terms of delivering, in terms of biodiversity, the wider natural environment, climate change, is Cairngorms Connect, which I was involved in establishing, and that has what's been successful. Why is that successful? You've got a group of neighbouring land managers who are got common objectives and are aiming to achieve the same ambitions. So you've got private sector, you've got NGO, RSPB are on it, Wildland, private sector, NatureScot and ourselves on a big scale. And we're able to manage the deer in that area without fencing, interestingly. We used to have fences, they've now been removed. But because of the sheer scale of it, it's a vast area in the Cairngorms. You can see the results of coordinated deer culling over many years now, and the results there. But there's not many like that. I think if you looked across the Highlands, that's an example we do tend to use. We need to see more of that, and it's how do we make that happen, I think, as a question. And we see other parts of where we manage, we're not achieving that. And that point before I made about incursions from neighbours, then you've got to put fences up. And then the fence is both expensive, and you only need one hole in it, so you get snow in the winter time, and deer can come in. So it is about landscape scale, deer management, without fences, people with common objectives, and how we make that happen.
Thank you. I've got Duncan and then Tom.
Yeah, so I won't repeat what Graham said, which was the point I was going to make, but the bit I would just add on to that is I think, as Graham has said, is, we're members of a number of deer management groups across Scotland, and to be honest, I think collaboration is patchy. In some places it is good, in other places it is not good, and it is not a very good system in terms of resolving some quite difficult conflicts. So, for example, Cairnlochan in the Cairngorms National Park, we've now had 25 years of voluntary control agreements in the Cairnlochan area, and still the deer densities are way above what is needed in terms of regenerating what is an important natural heritage area, part of the Cairngorms SAC, so a really important botanical area in the uplands of Scotland and, in fact, in the UK. Other examples where the deer management group system has really not helped resolve conflict with organisations that are trying to do the right thing in terms of what the government are asking them to do would be Assynt, would be another good example there, where John Muir Trust, John Muir Trust can speak better to this than I can, have been trying to do the right thing in terms of regenerating SAC habitats there for woodlands, but have been frustrated in their objectives by high deer densities on neighbouring ground.
I'm going to bring in David before Tom, just to respond to that. David.
Yeah, thanks. And Duncan's touched on a couple of the points I was going to make. I think I'd come back to that point around partnership or 3 points: partnership, scale and pace. So I would agree with the discussion we've had so far that the best way to tackle this issue is through partnership. That partnership needs to be at sufficient scale, and the issue that Duncan's talking about in terms of our land management in Assynt relates to effectively importation of deer from surrounding areas of land. So we could effectively, very significantly increase our cull rates, but continue to import stock from surrounding landscapes without that scale of partnership. You contrast that with perhaps some of the work that we've done in Nevis, where we do have that partnership at a sufficient scale. You're seeing regeneration of natural woodland with much less use of fencing, etc. That, however, takes a very significant amount of time to develop that partnership, to get it in place at the relevant scale. And I guess one of the questions we need to consider in this discussion is whether, that 5-10 years of building those partnerships and developing that scale of activity is a speedy enough response to address the scale of the problem that we talked about in question 1.
Tom.
Thank you. Coming back to the concerns about some of the deer management groups, it is a challenge to collaborate in any field, and competing objectives do create problems. As I mentioned earlier, I think we've come quite a long way. Duncan referred to Assynt. I was involved on Assynt. The deer management group had objectives to get deer numbers down to 7 deer per square kilometre, considerably below what the deer working group are doing. They had population models in place, and they were having deer counts with NatureScot to try and achieve those densities, and they were on the right path. The fallout in that situation was difficult, but I don't think it's insurmountable going forward. I think it's something that we should revisit. But it is challenging to collaborate, but it's absolutely vital. And Cairngorms Connect, what's been achieved there is very admirable, but it is 5 large landholdings that all have the same objectives. And if you are going to achieve those objectives, it does need to be done at scale, and that's not always possible. If you're a smaller landholding that relies on some form of income to ensure that you can employ your deer manager, then you may be relying on sporting income, and that's absolutely vital to some very remote communities in the Highlands. I think it's very important that we don't alienate those deer managers or condemn them for undertaking what is an extremely difficult job.
Thank you. Richard.
Thank you. Just to respond to Duncan's example of Cairnlochan, which has been a difficult area for a long time, looking forward rather than back, it's worth making the point that the deer population there now, after a big cull in the recent years, in particular this year, is edging towards 10 per square kilometre, and there's a strong likelihood, Donald may confirm, that the Section 7 agreement that's been in place there for some considerable time will be lifted in the very near future. But what I really wanted to make, the point I really wanted to make is that when we talk about deer impacts, we very often talk about deer as if they're the only herbivore in the Highlands, and that's simply not the case. There are large sheep populations in the red deer range. A population of around 300,000 red deer sits alongside 600,000 sheep, not evenly spread and not throughout the year, but the impacts of the sheep are just as significant as the deer impacts. There are also hares, rabbits, goats in some areas. So if we're going to address herbivore impacts, it's really important that we think about the whole picture and not just the bit that happens to catch the headlines at the moment.
I've just got maybe a question on that, and it's maybe for Donald. I remember dealing with deer management in a former Parliament and with the Clear Committee, and one of the very contentious issues was actually calculating deer densities, and whether that was looking at hoof prints, whether it was deer or sheep droppings, and trying to distinguish between the two, or using helicopters. Are we any further forward in actually having a consensus over the method of calculating what deer density is and density is of sheep or other herbivores?
Yeah, so there's a number of parts to that, I suppose, in that the data and information which underpins the decision that I talked about earlier on is really key. And there are a number of methods out there for assessing deer populations or deer densities, whether that's dung counting that you alluded to there, through the new technology around drones, through helicopter sensors work, and it depends on the species and the habitat that they're in. So the different methods that are used and applied in the different circumstances. So, but there's a range of techniques that are out there which are peer reviewed, and there's good evidence and robust information to support that. So yes, I mean I think that there are tools out there to do it. That comes at a cost, obviously, to do that as well, which is an issue. And it's not just about the populations, we're keen to stress it's about the impacts that deer cause as well. So the information that we're keen to gather is about what are the impacts, because the density and the impact relationship is key. If you're trying to get woodland establishment, you need very low densities of deer. If you're looking to have upland habitats in good condition, you might be able to sustain a slightly higher density of deer. So there's different aspects in that too. The other thing I would just raise in terms of the wider discussion is just the differentiation between species too in here and where they occur, and the methods that might be used for assessing and monitoring impact, and actually the management that's in place for that. Red deer in the uplands being a herding species, so the need to collaborate is much stronger there in terms of managing that shared population, where roe deer, more of a territorial species, and the management that's required for that. So that mixed with the different land uses and the land management that's out there means that there's different ways of doing that across Scotland, and that's absolutely the right way. But the technology is there, the methods are there. There are resource implications of that and cost of that, of course, when you're looking at that at a local, regional, national scale.
Okay. I've got Graham, Duncan, then I'm going to bring in Elena.
Okay, thanks. Just picking up Richard's comment about sheep. So a couple of comments there. From our things like thermal imagery, impact assessments, there are some parts of the land we manage where sheep are an issue. But in most cases, the primary issue is deer damage. So lots of evidence around that. And then if you look at the Highlands, based on my own experience over many years, and what I hear from people I speak to, what you see on the ground, there's many areas of less sheep now. So there's been, there's areas that used to have quite high density of sheep, don't have them anymore. And we are seeing cases where that's the case, where you're getting regeneration of the forest expansion when there's a reduction in sheep numbers neighbouring land we manage. So all evidence we gather is that the primary issue in terms of impact on trees, biodiversity, peatland is deer in the areas that we manage.
Duncan.
I was just going to say briefly, as we've heard, collaboration isn't always possible, but really we need to see the public interest asserted, and what hasn't happened over the past decades is that NatureScot haven't used their full range of their powers that are available to them to intervene in those circumstances, and that is urgently required in many places, and that is why we strongly support, for example, the concept of deer management nature restoration orders. The other aspect of the Deer Working Group recommendations, which we think would be really helpful in this context, is recommendation 97 of the Deer Working Group report, where we have a planned cull approval system working through NatureScot.
You want to come briefly on this before we move on?
Yes, just coming to regulations to DMNROs, which wasn't a recommendation of the Deer Working Group. That seemed to come from somewhere else. But on the Cairn Loughlin Section 7, that was something, the most recent Section 7 was asked for by the Deer Management Group to help them with their management. most deer management groups that have entered into Section 7, whilst it might have been reluctantly in the past, has actually been successful and a positive experience for those people entering into it. So I think regulation is not something that we're opposed to. It's just the quality of the regulations being used and how they're imposed.
Thank you. Elena.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to everybody. One of the most, I guess, emotive and worthwhile events that I've been to as a parliamentarian in this place was the event that Tim Eagle hosted for the Common Ground final report. And it's already been touched on this morning, but I would just like to explore that a little bit in terms of what that offers to the structures, what that offers to the possibility of that collaborative working. So when when the Centre for Good Relations helped to facilitate that, brought together stakeholders right across the country, including stalkers, right through to deer management groups, to all the organisations that are involved in terms of deer management. And I'm wondering if you could, some of you that are here were part of that Common Ground Forum, if you could actually speak to the benefits of it, and I guess what you hope that it's going to achieve in terms of the representation of deer management right across the country, because I think sometimes voices don't get heard. And I think if we listen to what Ross was saying earlier about lowland issues as well, I think sometimes that gets completely lost in the conversation. And we know numbers are increasing in the lowlands area in terms of roe deer. So I'm just asking for some comment round about the Common Ground Forum and how we as parliamentarians can help with that message. Don't know who wants to start.
Ross?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Common Ground Forum has been a huge success. It's not a surprise that it's been award-winning, and it's been a fantastic conduit to bring people together to discuss difficult issues. And I think we need to acknowledge that it has been a huge success, particularly, I would say, in the upland context. You won't be surprised to hear me bang the drum again for the lowlands. That is where we need some serious action, because over the years, it has been a dominant feature of legislation that's been brought before successive, UK Parliament and then the Scottish Parliament. The focus has always been on the Highland context, and that's all well and good. But if the Centre for Good Relations and the Common Ground Forum is to take forward additional work, publicly supported additional work, I think focusing on the lowlands and how to actually make meaningful progress there would be a really worthwhile endeavour. Because there are difficulties in the lowland context as well. There's, there's a shortage, believe it or not, of stalking opportunities for some people in the lowlands. Some people struggle to get access, even though we know that there is lots of deer in the lowlands there. So there's definitely opportunities, and I would say focusing on the lowland context perhaps in the future might be a really good thing for the Common Ground Forum to do.
Richard and then Tom.
I'm involved in the Common Ground Forum and have been since the outset. I've sat in this room a number of times with a number of other people around the table, and because we don't agree with each other, the deer sector presents itself as being at war, which is really can't be helpful for parliamentarians who are trying to develop policy and develop legislation. So recognising that actually we all largely want the same things with differences as to the detail, the spirit behind the Common Ground Forum was that we would bring those people who are interested in policy at this level, in this room, together. What has certainly for me been a great surprise is how widely the message has been valued, expanding beyond the people at policy level. And you referred to the event that you attended, Elena, and that's one of two, and there's another one coming. But I think what has been really extraordinary is how the deer management ground-level community has emerged and got involved in that and found it rewarding. And a lesson for all the organisations that we represent is that they have felt that they weren't well represented before that by us. So that's a lesson for us to learn. But in terms of the just transition, involving the people who actually do the job has been really eye-opening for a lot of people, not least Scottish Government teams who have attended these events, who have made it quite clear that they really value the new contact they have had with the people who are actually doing the deer management job. So it is the beginning of a really important culture change. It is not to say that we won't disagree about things in future as we have in the past, but we'll do so recognising the things we can agree on and respectful when we can't agree on them.
This might be bring in, Lee. Can you give us your experience of how it's worked together as a practitioner on the ground, actually carrying out this work? What's your view on this? And then I'm going to bring in Tom and Donald.
Yes, I think these events, this forum has been a great success. We've held two events on estates organised by the deer stalking community for deer stalkers, and it gives these guys an opportunity to come along and voice opinions, ask questions, which they normally would be reluctant to if they were in a bigger forum, a bit like I am here today. And certainly the second event that we held on the estate, there was a panel of civil servants there, and they took on board, I think very much on board, some of the points that were raised and questions that were asked. And I think possibly some of them didn't know who to come to speak to, like ourselves as a deer group in the SGA. And we've moved on a lot from that. We've had meetings with the civil servants and with the Minister. And I'd like to think, as a result of the decision yesterday, possibly came from some of the work that was done by the forum and some of the work that was done to try to get the civil servants to understand what the practitioners on the ground think.
Thank you. That's helpful. Donald and then Tom.
Yeah, so I mean, Nature Scott have been quite heavily involved in supporting the common ground work, which Tom and others have been involved in developing. I guess I would reiterate the point. I think that it really opens up the communication flow on some of the big and significant issues across the piece, right from the practitioner, the stalkers on the ground, of which there are different views on some of the issues as well. From a conservation, people who are taking control for conservation right through traditional sporting aspects in that. And this forum has allowed that discussion to take place and engage in some of the kind of policy issues that we are talking about, new legislation coming up, and an opportunity is afforded through that. So it's been a really worthwhile exercise, I think, in that respect. The engagement, as Lee alluded to there, from senior civil servants in that process has been really helpful in getting that grassroots type discussion ongoing. I think it also, these type of events, and we've got legislation come up, often lead to kind of a polarisation of views on deer management. And I think what the process has shown is that there is really a lot of commonality in that, a lot of people coming from the same place in it and trying to get the objective. And I think it was Duncan mentioned earlier on, it's about the scale and the pace and the timeframes over which this takes place, and the resource and the value that is taken from some of the people on the ground in that. So this process has been really helpful in that regard, and I think it has brought people together on some of the bigger issues.
So the common ground, a good blueprint for code development, code design, that up to now there's been lots of criticism, not just from Nature Scott, but government agencies, if you like, across the board, where that hasn't particularly worked. This is a good blueprint for success.
And there's different ways, but I mean, certainly from a Nature Scott approach, we've got the shared approach principles, which this is absolutely in line with, and for other species management that we are involved in, it's a model that we're looking to apply. Yeah.
Thank you. I've got Tom, and then Ross and David.
Thank you. I've mentioned already that I think that the Common Ground Forum has been a step forward. I think if someone had told me that I was going to be the signatory of a letter with Duncan to the Minister highlighting the values of venison and the need for support for the venison sector, 5 years ago, then I would have laughed. But the Common Ground Forum has enabled us to look at exactly that, where there is common ground. I think venison is one really important sector. And I think the drastic need for incentives and support for deer management as well, be that for larders in the lowlands, perhaps, as Ross alluded to, be that for some of the work undertaken in the highlands, be that habitat impact assessment, deer management group counting, and other things. Deer management is undertaken at a loss at all levels. And it receives considerably less support than any other rural sector. And I think those of us in the Common Ground Forum can agree that there needs to be real support for deer management.
Okay. Ross.
On that exact point, I mean, it was probably one of the most striking, I think, commonalities that emerged from the forum was obviously pretty much the kind of united view that incentivisation is definitely the way forward. We talk about carrot and stick a lot when it comes to deer management. In the past, things have been quite, I think, heavily orientated towards the stick, and I think with this new legislation that we're looking at as well, again, we're going to see it being quite regulation orientated. I don't think that's the right approach. I certainly don't think it's the right approach in the lowlands, and actually the Common Ground Forum was extremely valuable in that it really highlighted that everybody feels that incentivisation needs to happen. Now, we have a couple of pilot incentive schemes going on at the moment, south of Loch Ness and just to the north east of Glasgow as well. These are good, they're a start, but I think the reality is that the current incentivising schemes that are out there are nowhere near ambitious enough for what needs to happen to actually meaningfully incentivise deer management. We need to be properly incentivising people to cull more female deer. That's really what needs to happen for us to take meaningful action, and at the moment I don't think the schemes that are out there are nearly ambitious enough to actually deliver on the government's objectives.
Okay. I've got David, Duncan and then Malcolm.
Thank you. Yeah, a couple of points. I think first I'd come back to Ms. kind of challenge to us as a panel. What can the politicians do to help this? And I think lots of people have come in with the support for Common Ground. I've already said I think collaboration is important in this context. I guess for me it comes back a little bit to that point of pace and how can we use the common ground that's been created by the co-sign letters that other panellists have referred to translate into actions and specific outcomes that are going to help us tackle some of the issues that have been identified. I think Ross, you touched on it a little bit too in that balance between stick and incentivisation, and I guess we would see an opportunity to create a blend of both of those, if we're moving in the direction that, we've all signed up to in that kind of set of common ground. That set of sticks should be a backstop for areas where, for whatever reason, that management isn't happening, and the incentive should be, supporting a direction of travel that we're all signed up to. And I think, again, that's a space where, this kind of event, this committee, and the bills, etc., to come can help us going forwards.
Just to say, I mean, the backdrop to the Deer Common Ground initiative is clearly delivering the recommendations of the Independent Deer Working Group report as accepted by Scottish Government. It has been a very useful forum, as everybody else has said, I think, in terms of coming together to discuss issues. The common ground around venison and incentives, I think, is really marked. Certainly when it comes to venison, I think we all collectively want is all arms of government that have some involvement with venison to get behind venison. It is a healthy product. We currently import a lot of venison. The system for venison supply, getting more communities involved with venison, it's just not working. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it is an area where we really could spend a bit of time, I think.
Thanks, Convener. It's just a very quick, almost soundbitey general point about lawmaking, namely that if you can get bottom-up rather than top-down law reform, you're more likely to have something that tends to be accepted. Now, there will be moments of urgency or whatever, that top-down lawmaking is what you need to do, but if you've got something which can allow for the bottom-up, that's all the better.
Thank you. I'm now we're going to move on to another theme which is going to look specifically at the Deer Working Group report. And a question from Tim Eagle. Tim.
Oh, yeah, well, thank you very much and good morning, everyone. Actually, this is quite a broad question. So it is looking at the Deer Working Group report's recommendations, the Scottish Government response to that, timeline, implementation, and I guess also to throw into that the deer management, nature restoration orders and sort of thoughts around them. So just sort of broad points around all of that. That should take up another couple of hours.
Ross.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks, Mr. Eagle, for the question. I'm not going to beat around the bush on this one. There is a huge amount of trepidation around what is likely to feature in the legislation that we think will land next month. So if I can just paint a picture of what we think that's going to look like. You mentioned there the deer management nature restoration orders. This would essentially give the state, through NatureScot, the power to compel a landowner to cull deer based on something that might happen, namely nature restoration or nature recovery. Now, this is a departure from what's gone before, where kind of intervention has predominantly been predicated on damage that deer have caused. So this is really chartering, I suppose, a new territory in terms of regulation. And we think that what really is happening here is ministers are trying to make it easier for NatureScot to compel action. And that is all well and good. And, you know, Tom and I would probably be united in saying that there are circumstances where sometimes regulation is required, and we've supported regulation where it has sometimes been imposed. But this power, as it's proposed, is causing a lot of anxiety, a lot of anguish, because it won't be clear to people in what circumstances it could be imposed. You could quite feasibly say that any part of Scotland it could be recovered in terms of its nature capacity in some way, shape or form. So it really kind of leaves people in the dark about where might be subject to these sort of orders. And of course, if you don't comply with them, the consultation referenced potentially 3 months imprisonment or a fine of up to £40,000. So there are some quite stark implications, also cost recovery. So I think it's something that I think needs to be looked at again. I think there are some real legal difficulties with this order. I think it's going to reverberate quite significantly if it does feature in the bill next month. But I think what I would personally urge ministers to do is that instead of chartering a new order, the Deer Management Nature Restoration Order, why don't we look at the existing powers that we have and look carefully at what works and what doesn't work. Section 8, which gives ministers the power to establish a control scheme, has never been used. It's existed for over 60 years. Why are we creating a new power without first understanding the limitations of the powers that we currently have? It is absolutely absurd, and we really need to look carefully at this. So I think our plea to the committee, when you take the scrutiny off those provisions forward, if that's what ends up happening, is to look really carefully at the DMNRO, if it does feature, and also look at our current powers. Why is it that NatureScot have never used a Section 8? Why is it that Section 7 has always been there? And the reforms that they're looking to do to Section 10, which has been characterised in the past as emergency measures, no longer look like they're going to be emergency measures. It looks like it's going to be something that is used much more frequently. As I said before, and this is the final point, regulation is one part of the equation. Incentivisation needs to be the other part of the equation. Absolutely, regulation has a place, but for goodness sake, we mustn't lose sight of incentivisation, which is the only thing that's going to result in meaningful action here. The final point is this. These powers will not work in the lowlands. It will not complement the land ownership structures that exist in the lowlands of Scotland. It's no surprise that, you know, the circumstances in which Section 7 have been used have been confined to 2 kind of lowland circumstances in the past. Section 10, I think, once. You know, these sort of powers do not work well in a lowland context where we know there are issues. The lowlands need help, and these powers are not going to get the action that's required. So again, we're looking at a piece of legislation which is almost exclusively focused on the uplands, where collaboration is already happening relatively well, and I don't think it's going to go particularly well. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. I've got Donald and then David.
Yeah, so I'll just start on the kind of wider point about the Deer Working Group report and the recommendations of which, you know, there were 99 recommendations, 92 were accepted by Scottish Government. In terms of the detail and the update, obviously we have taken ownership of that, and there's a strategic deer board that's been set up across government agencies to make sure that that is managed, and there's a direction and leadership for that. The reporting of that is done, and it's done on a quarterly basis. So the updates are on the NatureScot website, which is available there in terms of all the 99 recommendations and the actions that are taken forward. So basically 22 of those have been delivered to date. About half of the recommendations in that were associated with legislative change, and obviously we've got a natural environment bill coming up, of which there'll be detail talked about in this. But there is an action plan, a series of programme of work across the government agencies and government to deliver on that. And we've tried to do that in an open and transparent way that is accountable there. So the NatureScot website has the detail on that. Obviously, in terms of some of the recommendations around the legislation, there's quite a series of recommendations in there, from quite specific technical detail in there, right through to more substantive kind of policy aspects of legislative change. The DMNRO aspect is one that was raised in the question as well. And obviously the principle here is about, going back to what I raised at the start, about the context in which we're operating in the biodiversity and climate crisis, and the need to move beyond what has been the prevention of damage to ensuring that we can underpin enhancement, improvement, restoration of natural processes and habitats in there. So that's the principle behind it. And in terms of the processes that are there, you know, we have the regulated process that currently set out, starting from trying to get voluntary agreement, that kind of ratcheting up to where we get into schemes where enforcement takes place. And I think that's very much the principle that's been explored in the DMNRO concept in terms of doing that. But to get back to Ross's point, yes, going back to the principles of better regulation, that has to be targeted, that has to be specific, there has to be a context on which these regulations are used, and that's set out in guidance, which I'm sure is the expectation.
I've got David, Tom and Duncan, but I think Ross, I'll give you the right to reply.
So it's a very quick point, and again it comes back to the existing powers. It's been characterised in the consultation by Donald just there as damage having to have been caused before the state can intervene. It's not the case in the legislation. The legislation talks about damage that deer have caused, are causing, or are likely to cause. The mechanism already exists for the state to intervene when deer might become a problem, yet that's never been used. And we need to understand why Section 7 and Section 8 haven't really been escalated on those grounds before. To me, a strict reading of the legislation suggests that you can intervene before deer have caused damage. There is no need for this new draconian power, which people are quite worried about. We need to be looking at why the current powers don't work before we start creating new ones.
Donald, briefly.
I mean, Section 7 has been used on that basis, and it's a prevention unlikely to cause damage. There has been cases that escalated to Section 8, and there's currently a case being escalated to Section 8, which is looking for ministerial approval going through that process. But you know, there are issues which have been raised in the Deer Working Group report about the kind of process and timescales for that, which are barriers to effective regulation.
Okay, David and then Tom.
Thanks, and I'll pick up a few of both those points. I mean, I think our sense would be Section 6 to 8, Section 7 and 8 particularly, have struggled to meet the objectives that we're collectively seeking. You know, while they've been in place, whatever the limitations of their current use, we've seen significant increases in deer numbers. The switch that has been talked about from damage to restoration of habitat, I think, is also an important point to pick up. You know, damage assumes that the baseline we're setting for a good habitat is the baseline we've got at the moment, and we know that that isn't the case. I come back to the stats I used earlier. 80% of our peatlands are degraded. We've only got 4% cover of natural forestry. So if we're setting the baseline there, that is a pretty low baseline. And to pick up the point on kind of carrot versus stick, again, I guess I'd come back to the kind of difference between, you know, the potential response we might need given very high numbers at the moment, you know, a climate and biodiversity emergency versus management of a sustainable population in a longer period of time. And I think, you know, you might see two slightly different types of approach to address the current overpopulation and then to support management of that sustainable population going forwards. And you know, you could see the kind of regulation sit more in the backdrop of the latter, and you know, more of the incentivisation to help us get to that sustainable level in the first place.
Tom and then Duncan.
Well, firstly, I'd like to just contest the success of some of the Section 7 agreements. I mean, NatureScot put out an announcement earlier this year, one on Cairnlochan and the other on the success of the North Ross Section 7 that have been implemented. So it would appear that in the competent authorities' views, those are being achieved, and those reductions in deer numbers are being achieved through Section 7. We don't contest that there should be some changes to the existing legislation. Ross has highlighted very well the concern around DMNROs, which seemed to come from out of left field. There was very little clarity as to what was going to be involved. There was mention of incentives. However, there was a question on the PDF, on the consultation, regarding incentives for DMNROs. That was not in the online form when you were filling out the consultation, so that was excluded from the consultation, which is frustrating, because if people are going to be encouraged to get deer numbers down to lower levels, there will need to be support and incentivisation to do that. I think we have big concerns around enhancement and restoration. They sound very good, but they are subjective, and they both would rely on evidence of damage. You would still have to measure that damage. The Deer Working Group report alluded to the fact that it is a challenge to demonstrate what can be achieved through enhancement. They state, however, there remains a significant degree of ambiguity that could give rise to challenges over what constitutes altering or enhancing the natural heritage and remedying damage to the natural heritage. So there are concerns from the Deer Working Group around that as well. So what we, I think, need is clarity. Bringing in new legislation would be unhelpful and would cast a great deal of concern in those people out there, particularly in the Highlands, who are already trying to deliver deer management and already trying to achieve targets. I think it's unhelpful as well that at a time when we're trying to achieve these targets, I suspect we can all agree on the fact that things like the Forestry Grant Scheme being cut are not helpful in that, the budget being cut. It's not helpful at a time when we're being encouraged to plant trees. I think we need to look differently at how we're doing things. It was alluded to earlier as well. I think we need a little bit less stick and a little bit more carrot involved in deer management. Regulation is vital in some circumstances. It's been successful in some circumstances recently. But new regulation coming out of the blue very late in the day with very little consultation around it is unhelpful, and very unhelpful to voluntary collaboration as well.
Duncan.
Yeah, I'm afraid I think there's a bit of a rosy glow being put around Section 7 agreements. I mean, if you look at Recommendation 75 of the Independent Deer Working Group report, it says the Eclair Committee should consider holding a short inquiry into the use of the Section 7 control agreement at Cairnlochan, which has never happened so far. I mean, it feels to me that, the reason Nature Scott has not used its powers over the years is largely because they are unworkable, and, proving prevention of damage has also proved extremely difficult. So this is why we're moving to this, the suggested new approach, which is around enhancement. And we think all of the tools in the toolbox should be directed towards enhancement. So that's Section 6 to 10 of the Deer Act, which are currently focused around prevention of damage rather than enhancement, as well as using deer management nature restoration orders. Isn't it right that public monies, if they're being deployed in this arena, are used towards enhancement rather than preventing damage? And as we heard earlier, deer management is one of the tools in the toolbox that delivers a whole wide range of public benefits, from peatland restoration, woodland expansion, prevention of human damage through road traffic accidents, Lyme disease, etc., as well as enhancing biodiversity. It is one main action that can be taken by Scottish Government that delivers a whole range of cross-cutting rural benefits.
Just listening, it fills me with fear about who's going to decide where should be enhanced and where shouldn't be, and which section should come under this sort of. Should it apply to foresters? Should it apply to people involved in agriculture, or people involved in agri-tourism or infrastructure? So, if you're applying it to the deer sector, who decides? Who's the final arbitrator, and what should it be restored to? Or
so other countries.
It sounds like we're opening Pandora's box in terms of making decisions on enhancement.
No, I mean, in other countries, convener, they manage it. I mean, in Norway, landowners are required to manage deer numbers to levels which do not compromise the public good. I know in some states in Germany, going on to agricultural damage, if deer populations and other herbivores, wild boar, etc., are not managed sustainably, then agricultural producers can claim compensation from hunting groups. So, there are systems that are set up in other countries that deal with precisely this issue.
Thank you. I've got Graham and then Richard.
Okay, yeah, just picking up the points about enhancement and restoration and baselines, and picking up Duncan's comment there, looking beyond Scotland. Like we know know that Scotland's a very degraded in terms of biodiversity, one of the most degraded in world terms. So is that wider context? So I think we've got to bear that in mind when we have these sort of discussions and think about what sort of outcomes we're trying to achieve. I always try to think what we're trying to achieve at the bigger scale and sort of work backwards. We have got examples in Scotland where it has worked. I mentioned Cairngorms Connect so far, but another one's the Great Trossachs Forest. Again, it's another partnership which involves ourselves and Scottish Water and others. And when you see it, you can actually go and see real examples of success. And in terms of drawing together, particularly in that case, native woodland regeneration expansion, which is basically free beyond the deer management. You're not going to plant the trees, cultivation, fencing, all of those costly operations. So you're getting in a big scale, which shows the potential, I would say, of being a forester, of woodland expansion in Scotland with native woodland is tremendous. And the main reason that's what's hampering that is deer densities, basically, because you can see the difference. I'm sure you've all seen the photographs of an area where you've got inside and outside the fence. Inside the fence, lots of regeneration, comes in naturally as long as you've got seed trees. Outside the fence, high browsing pressures, you don't. So we have got good evidence of what restored and enhanced habitats can be when you work at that landscape scale and bring the browsing pressures down. So I think we need to take advantage of that and keep that in our minds.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My clerk's keeping me right, so I've not noticed all the hands. So I've got Richard, Ross, Donald and David.
Thank you. I think can we say, and I'm quite sure I can say it without fear of contradiction, that everybody in this room wants to see environmental improvement on a steady plane, which I personally believe, having been an observer of the countryside, has been the case for some decades. I think where the direction of travel, perhaps too slow, is in the right direction. But on this subject, which has been raised of incentives and penalties, could I just simply point out that if you were a farmer or a forester and you were expected in terms of government policy to deliver restoration or enhancement, there would be grants available to help you to replace hedges, to help you to restore wetlands, to help you to put in conservation headlands. Why should the deer sector be different? I'm really saying, as others have said, that we need we need the carrots as well as the sticks.
Ross.
Convener, the big problem with predicating this on nature restoration is that deer management interventions are not the only things that deliver nature restoration. Therefore, it's really kind of difficult, I think, to use that as the basis on which these powers are imposed. There's every chance that even if you do deliver the cull targets that you're expected under a deer management nature restoration order, nature still may not be restored because, for example, there could be a whole load of sheep on the hill, for example. There are issues here, and it's very interesting in the consultation paper, Scottish ministers they acknowledge this problem, but they don't give you a solution as to how they're actually going to deal with it. So I think that's a really important point. The second point's a really kind of boring procedural one, but is important. If I'm a landowner and this is imposed on me, there's a right to appeal to the Scottish Land Court, which is all well and good, except it's very difficult to appeal against something that may or may not happen. What do I use in my arsenal to say, yeah, deer management is not going to deliver nature restoration, or it is, or whatever? It's a very subjective, ambiguous thing. And again, coming to the lowland context, if this power was imposed in the lowland context, so let's say it's on the farmer's land whose deer I shoot for him in the year, he's given a cull target by Nature Scott, he's got a complement of recreational stalkers. How is he going to then compel them to go and kill more deer? Without the incentives that Richard's talking about, it's just not going to happen. And I think all of these issues in the round perhaps demonstrate why the Deer Working Group didn't recommend this. This proposal was introduced a year ago now, so we were under the Butte House Agreement at that point, and I commend as then was Minister Slater for a lot of the really good stuff that's in the consultation, because there is loads of good stuff for modernising things. But this proposal is not something that I think is going to be a help to the deer management sector in Scotland, not in the Lowlands, nor in the Highlands. I think it will be a hindrance more than a help, and I do think it needs to be dropped.
Thank you. Donald.
I was just coming back to, I think, the point that you made, Convener, just about we're not opening a Pandora's box. I think, the whole principles of better regulation is that that's proportionate, targeted, accountable, in terms of that. And I think that the framing of this, and that, we'll see what comes through in the bill, essentially. But the principle here is that this is not something that's going to be applied. There has to be grounds and a clear criteria as to where and when this can be applied and what circumstances. And that's a kind of public policy, public interest kind of test. Would be the kind of basis for that. So that there is a good rationale, objective, clear, open and transparent way to land managers on where and when this type of approach will be taken. And the expectation, I think, would be that they would go through the voluntary principle, getting to a regulatory piece at some point if that wasn't achieved. But the balance of regulation and incentive is important there.
David, and then Tom, and then we'll move on to our next question.
Thanks. A couple of points just on the kind of lowland model. I guess I pick up the mention elsewhere of southwest Norway, where that model of community hunting works pretty well in that kind of analogous context. The substantive point I wanted to make there was on the kind of spending of public money and making sure that's most efficient and well targeted in this way. And I guess a little bit of a model that might help illustrate some of that. So if we're talking about improvement of habitat, if we put a 50-metre buffer around all areas of native woodland, we'd create an additional 320-ish thousand hectares of native woodland for colonisation in Scotland. Over a 10-year period to fence that, we'd be looking at the best part of 1.25 billion, an equivalent period of 10 years managing deer to sustainable levels, roughly 0.5 billion, so 50 million a year, less if you included the potential income from that. So I support the point made earlier around the cuts to the forestry grant scheme, but we have an £80 million pot there. You could potentially spend 25 million of that on deer control, significantly impact the deer problem that we've got at the moment, and create 320,000 hectares of native forestry. So I think there's something for us to consider in how we best target some of the spend in this area.
Tom.
I would, well, just as a response to that, initially, I would contend that deer fencing is a vital tool in the toolbox for deer management. It's absolutely necessary in some circumstances, particularly in some of those areas where sick spruce plantations have been established and deer management is very difficult. And if you're trying to protect native woodland in those areas, a deer fence, I believe, will be absolutely vital. So I would encourage people to also look at the costs of employing a full-time deer manager as well. I think NatureS Scott estimates within the Deer Working Group report that the income from deer management every year is 15.8 million and the expenditure is 36.8 million. So, there's a big difference there, and 80% of deer management is undertaken by the private sector. So there's a lot of money being spent on deer management, and I'll go back to the fact that it needs increasing support. I think that Donald raised the importance of voluntary deer management, and NatureS Scott seeing that as the way forward to deliver deer management, particularly in the Highlands. And we have that voluntary structure already in place. But those people who are voluntarily managing deer collaborate regularly with NatureS Scott. And I think if the regulations that are put in place are too draconian, people will be less willing to voluntarily collaborate. And that's what is being risked here.
Thank you. I'm now going to move on to the final question in this section. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Some of you have already started to touch on where I was going to go, but before I bring in, I wanted to get into a bit more detail on some of the recommendations potentially, but I'm really glad that people have started to talk about the carrot in a bit more detail, because I think that's really helpful. And I remember having a conversation not that long ago around the idea that we could spend £15 million to save 640 million. So with people who are knowledgeable and thoughtful about these things, people who have been involved in the Common Ground Forum. And I think that's a really interesting point, that if we actually invest in deer management and doing it properly, that we could save over time a great deal to the public purse. Now, having conversations with the government around that, that's difficult, budget constraints and things like that. But I would be interested to hear, and I think it was great that, David, you brought in some kind of specifics there, but to hear from others, what kind of thing do we need in terms of that carrot? Like, so for example, it's been proposed to me that if we delivered a subsidy for venison price to estates of at least £3 per kilogram of venison produced over and above the average annual total. But no, I think this is important because I think
but we're coming up to the venison and venison market.
But it's all connected, convener, and that's what people have been trying to get at here.
Could you just bear in mind that we have got members that are asking
I
that
understand
question
that,
specifically?
but, okay, so I won't talk about the venison, but we have to talk about the venison. But in terms of how can we get the government to subsidise the deer management and give us that carrot, and what would that look like on an estate? And another piece, Ross, I see you're signalling, another piece that's not connected to that, but I really want to understand, why is the lowland different and why does it need help? So I feel like we didn't get that cleared up earlier on when you were bringing that up and others have brought it up. So don't go too deeply into that, but I just want to understand for our future work, why is that being tackled differently? But yeah, if you could understand what kind of carrot we really need, because as a committee, that's the kind of thing I'm hearing. We don't want strong measures necessarily. We want more motivation for people. And I heard from Common Ground people, deer stalkers on the ground, the cost and the effort it takes to go and take 1 or 2 deer off the hill, and you can only take 2 off a hill at a time, I understand. So there's a lot to it that we need to really get under.
Ross.
Thank you, Ms Burgess. And very quickly on the lowland point, so the critical difference is that you don't have full-time deer managers generally operating in a lowland context. There are some exceptions on publicly owned land, for example, but on farmland, for example, it's generally done by trained recreational deer stalkers. Those are people, obviously, that don't have the ability to commit themselves full-time to managing deer in the same way that someone who's maybe working on an upland estate might. Similarly, they're quite often paying for the privilege in the form of an annual kind of let, if you like, so they'll pay to do it. And then obviously there's the infrastructure side of things as well, which I briefly touched on. They wouldn't necessarily have the access to a comprehensive larder facility that a large estate might, for example. So there's probably quite a lot of their own time and costs that will be involved in actually undertaking deer management, which ultimately results in less deer being culled than perhaps you might expect from someone doing it full-time on an upland estate. In terms of incentives, so 2 things I think need to happen urgently. I think there should be a incentive per kilogram of venison, and in particular I'd be talking about kind of female deer again in this context, because we know that that's where the principal issue is. A lot of the incentive schemes that currently exist are kind of predicated on meeting your average annual cull over the last 5 years. So once you get to 100% of that, that's the point at which the incentive is triggered. I think we need to do better than that and actually give it wholesale for every single beast that goes through the door. You get an incentive if it's a female deer that's been culled. And then the second thing, and I did touch on this, and again, this is probably a little bit more specific to the lowland context, but community deer larders and community chillers. If we had a network of those in the lowlands of Scotland, more people would be able to manage deer and ultimately put deer into the food chain. At the moment, we don't really have that. There are some really good facilities. FLS has some really good larder facilities, for example, and a number of organisations do have these community larders, but they are few and far between, and we could do with greater investment. And I think it's probably worth just putting on record, there was last year talk of having for the first time, a fund around kind of investing in these sort of infrastructure. That was kind of dashed at the very last minute, I think, due to budgetary constraints, which obviously are understandable. But I know that was a real disappointment for those of us in the sector that have been lobbying quite hard for many years for greater investment in community infrastructure, because I think it could genuinely make a real difference in a lowland context in particular.
Richard.
Thank you, Convener. I was the chair of the Lowland Deer Network when it was set up in 2011 and did that role until 2018. So I have a bit of an insight into the murky world of deer management in the lowlands, which, as Ross has said, is very different from the highlands, where there is a structured approach. In the lowlands, well, to concentrate on the things we don't know who's doing it, except we know that largely it's a recreational activity. We don't know how many deer there are. We don't know what the cull is. Nature Scot don't get statutory returns from the people who are doing the culling. The only record we actually have is the firearms register for the people who own rifles that are suitable for managing deer. The Deer Working Group identified the lack of knowledge as a serious problem and needing to be addressed in regard to the area of Scotland out with the Highlands, it's very pleasing to hear now that there's a general recognition that the problem in the lowlands, if anything, is greater than it is in the Highlands. And one would hope that the forthcoming legislation will find ways to deal with that. But the absolute priority for that is getting information as to where they are, what the species are, who's doing the culling, where the hotspots are, and then we'll have a basis for a much more structured approach to management.
Donald.
So just coming on to the kind of incentive piece, I mean, I think we recognise that deer management is generally undertaken at a cost, and that, you know, to offset that is largely, the only way of doing that is through kind of some kind of sporting income or through venison sales, and that's the kind of offsetting the cost of it. So the understanding that deer management is an expensive and time-consuming and resource-intense activity to take place. I guess it's the nature of that support that is provided is the key thing. And, you know, venison, which we're not touching on too much, we're coming on to that, is one way of looking at that. There's other pilot schemes that are out there just now looking at trying to support the actual deer killing that's taking place. And Ross mentioned them earlier, the Nature Scot schemes in South Loch Ness and the Central Belt. And there's also a Cairngorm National Park scheme that's running to try and test the approaches to see what are the incentives that can be delivered to try and boost that and to get and support the numbers of deer that are killed to deliver on those outcomes. But in terms of the lowlands as well, at that point, the infrastructure issue is also a different aspect that's there. Generally in the Highlands and the uplands and the estates that are involved in that, there is good infrastructure there, larders, facilities to do that. In the lowlands, there generally isn't that. And that's one of the areas that we're looking at, and we're just about to launch a scheme to try and support that, albeit it is constrained in terms of the funding that's available for that. But the next week or two, we will see that to try and test that. Obviously, the scale of that is the issue, and the sums of money that we're talking about there, the £15 million, is not something that we're operating in. There's different aspects there in terms of the schemes that Nature Scot are running. But yes, if we are serious about deer management, it is integration within the kind of wider future rural support mechanism that's there, and that bigger aspects of funding that are required, because we know there are wider biodiversity climate benefits that can be delivered from deer management, and it's one of the key tools in that. But is more integration with the other kind of more holistic approach to land management and support.
Duncan and then David.
I'd just ask Donald to give a bit more detail on those pilots, because that would be helpful to understand what's going on there. Another pilots. Approach, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, there are 3 pilots, and essentially what they are doing is looking to incentivise the killing of more deer than has been taken previously. So where we set a baseline in terms of a number of deer that were taken, largely by the private sector, but by the estates and properties involved, where they have agreed to increase that cull, we will pay on the basis of the number of deer shot a value, £70, to try and support that. £70 per deer.
That's
shot.
right. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And that's targeted at female deer, because as has been alluded to earlier, that's how we more successfully control populations around the female deer.
And then David.
So agree with Donald's point about better integration of deer management into rural development schemes, and the incentives that we're talking about here also need to be given a fair wind. I mean, we're only in year 1 here. These need to be, I mean, the uptake, as I gather it, has not been great so far, but, the history of these things is probably the uptake will develop over the years. But I think the other important point here is we're not necessarily talking about new monies here. I mean, when it comes to woodland expansion in most other European countries, that's delivered through natural regeneration, through herbivore management, rather than planting. So I think looking at the FGS, looking at currently the expenditure on deer fencing we talked about earlier is between £10 to £15 million per annum. Would those monies be better directed, for example, to enhance stalking effort, looking at where the existing funding is going, and better integration as well? I mean, what we really need here is, which I think has been lacking when it comes to venison, we're talking about increasing the cull target of 50,000 animals per annum if we're going to get a declining deer population on the 1 million animals that we have now and get us on a downward trajectory. We have to have somewhere for those carcasses to go. We think there's a big market out there, but we're not exploiting that properly. And so we need the other arms of government involved, like Scotland Food and Drink, like Quality Meat Scotland, these other parts of government that have, assets that could be brought to the table.
Can I ask everyone just to be brief on this? So I've got David, Tom, Lee and Richard.
Thanks, Convener. Duncan has spoken to one of my points, which is just to reiterate the point on forestry and grants scheme, that we could spend as little as 25 million of that potentially to significantly increase our level of native forest cover and address the current population of deer. I guess I'd also seek to broaden out a little bit, and I think there's something to distinguish between the initial kind of government support that might be needed to address the problem we've got, and then longer-term sustainability and viability going forwards. And I guess picking up a little bit, Donald, your point around how you integrate this into wider land management practice going forwards, perhaps a couple of stats in terms of economic contribution. Shooting estates creating about 6% of the direct jobs and 13% of the indirect jobs that the forestry sector does, a 43 million contribution compared to a 1 billion contribution. So I think there's something we can begin to think about there in how you can bring together a more integrated management between the traditional stalking, some forestry that might take you towards some of that longer term sustainability and drive the revenue that you need to then sustain those or maintain, those sustainable levels going forward.
Thank you. Tom.
I'll be brief. I think as well as incentives, which will be vital, I think we need to consider some of the barriers to change that are in place. Anyone that's applied for EECS, FGS, peatland restoration, nature restoration funds, I think there's an element of application fatigue out there. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it's difficult, and it can take months and months, if not years, to get into some of these schemes. And once you've done that a couple of times, you're shy of doing it again.
Lee.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. SGA had proposed an urban deer pilot, which is still on the table if folk were interested, or the government was interested. It cost in the region of £10,000 to set up a larder. There would be 10 qualified stalkers sharing that larder with a level 1 or level 2, and they reckon they could cull 100 deer per year. And we think that is very cost effective for the taxpayer. That offer is still on the table.
Richard.
Thank you. Firstly, just to make the point that the proposal to the former Minister for a venison support scheme was signed jointly under the auspices of the Common Ground Forum by Duncan, Tom and myself as Scottish Venison Chairman. And we were very pleased that it was well received. It was made known to us very quickly that there wasn't money for a national scheme. What we proposed was a subsidy of £1 a kilo for all females and juveniles across the board. And £1 a kilo would have been just about enough to make deer management break even. Having said that, we welcome the pilot schemes because they set a precedent for government support for deer management, which had never happened before. But we were critical of the design of the schemes, which were based on paying for on a headage basis for the uplift in the cull. In the case of the Cairngorm scheme, the cull was known, and that was possible. In the case of the other two schemes, because of what I said before, is that we don't know how many deer there are, we don't know who's culling them, we don't know what the cull is, there's no baseline, so it's impossible to calculate the uplift. So if a scheme was to be introduced on a headage basis, which is probably, I hate to say this as the Scottish Venison Chair, the most practical way of doing it, then it needs, for at least an initial period, to be for the whole of the female cull, not just for the uplift, because we have no means of measuring it, and it's just far too difficult to try and create a complicated formula that deals with that.
Before we move on, we are going to have a short break, but I just want some brief comments on the working group recommendation progress update, specifically about, and it's what you've touched on just in your last response, data and research. Are we making progress on collecting data and research on which to base our future policies. Is progress good enough on that? Ross?
I mean, I think it could be better, Convener, but I would commend Nature Scott for the work that they've put into the app that they're developing. Donald will be able to say more about this, but I think that could genuinely be a bit of a game changer in terms of kind of how record keeping is kept.
Duncan.
Yeah, so FLS kind of led the way on this with their wildlife management dashboard, which is a very good system, I think, and latterly Nature Scott have now developed, as well as Ross said, the deer data collection app. It is absolutely critical we have good deer population data to inform management and targeting of management effort, and most other similar countries that have effective deer management structures in place rely on that data to a large extent to inform where culling effort takes place. So we need investment in that, and we need one system for the whole of Scotland. We can't have an FLS system and a Nature Scott system. So hopefully the two systems talk to one another.
We've got three people want to contribute. Could you also cover, do you think we are in a position now that only weeks before we're looking at legislation on deer management, do we have sufficient data and research to back that up, to make us confident we're making the right decisions? If you can cover that in your responses, that would be helpful. I've got Donald, Graham, Lee and Tom.
So it's just, I mean, and it's included in the updates that are there, but I mean, we've done a lot of work in terms of our online licensing for deer management. So that was one of the recommendations that were in the deer working group report. That has been delivered in terms of the cull return system, the authorisations aspect of that. So that has been a pretty significant development. We are looking to, and it was mentioned earlier on, the reach that we have in terms of cull returns, extending that, which has primarily been in kind of an upland focus, about 4,000 properties. This spring, we'll be looking to extend that with links to the ARPID system to get a much broader reach to around 18,000 properties. So that broader reach throughout Scotland, picking up upland and lowland deer. So we've got that. The app that's been mentioned by Duncan is being piloted as part of these pilot schemes that we were talking about. So again, the ability to get use of technology to get better data and information in there. And then the last point I think I'd make on that is just about the wider technology that's developing, the drone use, the wider technology that's there for habitat, understanding habitat impact as well, is increasing as well. Satellite technology, all the rest of it is really coming on stream. So the ability to use that data and technology is something that is adapting and developing all the time. And I think, yes, we are getting and we have better information. We will never have the perfect information, I think, like most of the environmental nature, wildlife issues. We'll never have perfect information, but we have a good basis, I think, to have the discussion about the legislation that's coming through. But there are always gaps there, and it's understanding what they are and working to fill them. So.
Thank you. Graham, and then Lee.
Yeah, so thanks, Duncan, for mentioning our wildlife management system. So that's been established for a number of years, based on a number of sources of data, and doing population modelling and setting culls on that basis. So we're always very happy to share that. So there's probably quite a lot we could, beyond the meeting today, that we'd be very happy to share with the committee. We've got a lot of experience and knowledge now, and obviously it covers important thing to say in terms of what we manage. We manage, say, 9% of Scotland, but only 2/3 of that is forest. So we manage a lot of hill land. So we manage a pretty good, diverse range of habitats in Scotland. So maybe we'd be happy to share that knowledge and experience and over a big chunk of Scotland, if that would be helpful to the committee.
Thank you. Lee.
Yeah, just could I ask a question? Is there any council in Scotland which has a deer management plan?
That's Donald saying yes, but
yes, there are a number who have deer management plans. I don't know off the top of my head, but about a dozen, I think, that have deer management plans and who actively manage deer. But it's not the case that all local authorities have deer management plans or manage deer.
Okay, that's an interesting avenue for us to look at. Tom.
Just on data, backing up what Duncan said, data is vital. I think we're all gathering in the Highlands, or a lot of us are gathering habitat impact assessments, data on woodland assessments, populations, that sort of thing. I think where some support would be useful is on disseminating that data, putting it into maps, utilising it properly. I think not all deer managers are computer whizzes, and it would be useful sometimes to have some support. Whilst NatureScot do that, it would be useful to have more support going forward on that data dissemination.
Thank you. I think that's a good point. I'll suspend the meeting until 10:50. Okay, we're now going to consider our look at our discussions with the Deer Working Group report, and we're going to move to a section which focuses on the rural economy and the venison sector. And firstly, I'd like to ask Rhoda Grant for her question.
So we have touched on the venison sector during the discussion, and that's not surprising. But is there a way, and people have talked about costs of deer management and the like, and importing venison. So it seems to me we're missing a trick. We could actually use this venison, and it's incredibly wasteful not to use it, to be fair. How can we then make sure that this venison is used, it gets to market, offset some of the costs, but is not wasted, you know, a source of protein, good, healthy source of protein being left to rot on the hill is pretty much obscene.
I'll start with Richard.
Thank you for the question. Music to my ears.
I wasn't going to sing.
To pull back a bit, and this was referred to a bit earlier, but venison sales are the only income stream for deer management, with the exception of a smallish percentage, probably 20%, where there is some hunting element income to supplement, to ameliorate the loss, so to speak. BASC did a study about 2 years ago where they calculated that the cost of culling a deer, of producing a kilogram of venison, red deer, was $2.58 per kilogram. The price we typically get per kilogram is between £1.50 and £2. And that price applies to all species, actually. The cost of culling a smaller deer, a roe deer in the lowlands, because the conversion costs are very much the same, is actually over £7. So the net cost of culling deer, which falls entirely on the producer and is not relieved by any subsidy at present, is very considerable. In other words, we're being encouraged to increase our cull, but that just increases the shortfall in the deer management business, in that every deer culled is an extra cost. So you talk about incentives, that's a disincentive to increase culling. I'm not saying that applies in many cases, because where the job needs to be done, people do it for that reason, for population management. But it is certainly not a positive effect. You mentioned import. It's true that we import. Well, currently the overall output for Scottish venison is something like 3,500 tonnes. We import about 1,000 tonnes and we export about 1,000 tonnes. And there are reasons for that, although it sounds a bit half-baked. The component that we export tends to go to Europe, where they like the stronger tasting venison around the time of the rut, which is when most of the males are culled. What we bring in is brought in by the processors largely to meet market demand, because if they're dealing with the multiple retailers, they want the seasonality doesn't work very well for them, so they want venison throughout the year. So New Zealand venison, for example, is brought in to meet ongoing orders by the main processors to have continuity of supply. So that's the reason you get that rough trade-off between what comes in and what goes out. If we shoot the extra 50,000 deer that Nature Scotting are pressing us to do, and indeed the cull is increasing all the time, that would add a further 1,000 to 2,000 tonnes of venison to the mix. So it's essential that we have markets to take that venison. Compared with other red meats, well, first of all, its quality, it outperforms all other red meats in terms of healthy eating, just to say that. But it's a very, very small element of food production, meat production, if you set it against beef and cattle, and indeed white meat. So it's a small industry and very far spread across Scotland. And the infrastructural aspects are a big cost, which other industries don't bear. What I'm trying to say, basically, is that deer management, and it's been said before, is very much a net cost exercise. And that goes to the absolute core of the venison trade. Scottish venison has a big job to do to grow the market and close the gap on value over the coming years. And that's a really important aspect of increasing the cull. It is all linked. The whole deer sector is linked, and the economy of deer is very closely related to the value of venison. I can't remember what the other part of your question was, Rhoda, but...
what do we need to do, I guess?
What do we need to do? Well, it's about the money. At the moment, and we talked a lot about incentives and penalties, so I won't go over all of that again, but we need to find a way to introduce money into the system, because if you subsidise venison, which sends out a very good signal about the quality of the product and it helps the marketing of it, then that actually trickles right down through the whole of the deer sector, right down to the blacksmiths who shoot the ponies, who take the deer off the hill. It lifts the whole sector. And in terms of just transition, relatively small amounts of money. And we calculated that the proposal that we jointly put to Scottish Government, the cost of subsidising venison across all females, all species, all of Scotland, per annum would be in the order of 3 to 5 million, which, if you compare it with the subsidy that goes into agricultural production, is so small as to be just a comma in the sentence, so to speak. But the money wasn't available at the time, although the argument was accepted. So it's about the money.
Duncan, David, Ross and Tom. Duncan.
Yeah, so agree with Richard. I mean, we've got a really healthy food product, provided, of course, the deer are shot with non-lead ammunition, which we're well on the way to most of the deer in Scotland being shot with non-lead ammunition. But that needs to be a total ban on lead. I think the other areas that you need to look at here are around public procurement. So there are some examples already of this, where some relatively small-scale examples of where deer venison is being provided to schools, hospitals, etc., but that needs to be looked at carefully. The other area that we would highlight is around community venison initiatives. I mean, at the moment we've got two main venison providers, Highland Game and Ardguy Game, who take most of the carcasses in Scotland. There is a genuine appetite there for smaller scale community-type providers, but at the moment there are some quite significant barriers around setting up these sort of community-type initiatives. Again, looking at other countries, in Norway, community venison provision is quite routine. We've discussed this with Food Standards Scotland. They are looking into some of these ideas, but this needs to be given far greater scrutiny. Examples, so for example, in Norway, individual hunters are allowed to butcher animals on the hill, take the best, because they're often working in quite remote areas, as are some of our stalkers. They're allowed to take the best cuts of meat, transport them off the hill, and then provide them to friends, relatives, and local folk if they are an accredited hunter. They can't supply to supermarkets and that kind of thing. These are precisely the kind of arrangements we need to look at here.
Thank you. David, and then Ross.
Thanks, yeah, and I'll be brief because others have covered similar ground. I'm with Duncan on lead shot, and I'd add a bit of colour to the examples I think we've seen in the press just this week. Coverage of Argyll and Bute schools on Isla and Jura getting venison onto school dinner menus. We've seen coverage of Cairngorms Connect and the work that they're doing on building skills in local communities for managing and butchering venison. That is all good, and I think if we're looking at significant reduction in numbers, then we should be seeing this as a significant opportunity ahead of us to further develop all of those and more. I guess one note of caution, and perhaps slightly channeling a former life, but on a kind of overall market subsidy rate, I think we'd need to think carefully about how that was compliant with things like the UK Internal Markets Act and how we managed some of that. But yeah, I think we would strongly support any measures that we can put in place to get more venison into local supply chains.
Thank you. Ross.
Thanks, Convener. in response to your question, Ms. Grant, one of the kind of key issues as emerges at some points through the year, and this isn't a constant problem, but we're aware, for example, the back end of the stag season this year, there was a real capacity processing issues in some parts of Scotland. So, for example, we're aware of an estate that lost a full week of hind stalking, so managing the females, as a result of the backlog that was going through at the end of the stag season. So I think, we do have obviously people that are willing to process venison in Scotland, and some of the names have been mentioned already, but there is, I think, perhaps a capacity issue there that does emerge at some points in the years, which would be helpful to be addressed. I think, again, to kind of comment a little bit on the lowland context for some of this. It is difficult for recreational stalkers to put venison into the food chain. I think that's fair to say. I mean, the price per kilogram has been mentioned there, which is not exactly fantastic. And obviously, a lot of people are kind of expending their own time and money on doing it anyway. They're not being paid. But I would also comment as well that there is a significant cost to even go into stalking if you want to do it recreationally. You have to you have to get a firearms certificate, which now actually, as a result of recent changes, costs near enough £200. You've then got to buy a rifle. That's £1,000. A scope. That's another £1,000, moderator, etc. It's a real cost to actually enter the sector in the first place. So I think those things are worth considering in the round. And then I would just support the point that was raised around local supply chains. I think it would be really fantastic if we could find more ways where local venison could be consumed locally. That is hard. I'd say that's particularly difficult to do in a lowland context. But I think again, investment in kind of community facilities would be really helpful, and then you can try and join it up with more local businesses to actually sell the venison.
I'm sure you're looking forward to the Good Food Nation plan.
Oh, yes.
And where the government might have to abide by its recommendations. That's coming to a committee near you soon.
Great.
I've now got Donald and then Tom.
So just from a Nature Scot perspective, I mean, we have an interest in this and we're keen to support Scottish venison, but there are other public bodies there that obviously Scotland Food and Drink and Food Standards Scotland who are involved in venison specifically. But I mean, we see it as an inherent part of making sure that there is the support there for effective deer management taking place and recognising the benefits of, obviously the income stream that comes into that, but also the benefits that provides for wider nutritional good products, healthy food that's coming onto plates. So there is that aspect of it. I mean, the schemes that and we're keen to support schemes that are coming through, but as David alluded to there, there are issues around that in terms of intervention in a market. It's a relatively small market in there by, essentially putting a pound on a kilogram of venison that's procured. And so there are issues that would need work through in terms of that, if that is possible. The pilot schemes that we've looked at is looking at helping that supply come onto the market through the production and the producer doing that on the ground. And that's where the support that we have put into that, because that's where our locus is in that. And there's a kind of rationale for that. I guess the other piece is just moving this from a resource cost, as we've outlined earlier on. There are significant benefits and added value from moving from the production, as in the culling, into the production and the supply of venison, and moving that into an income generation scheme there. So, but it does require that investment in skills, training, infrastructure, equipment that is there. But we are seeing a growth in that area, I think, in terms of in local areas, people doing venison supply coming through in that regard and getting the benefit in that, both from a community perspective and a kind of property perspective. So there is a growing area, I think, but we still will be reliant on those big game dealers, to take the biggest chunk of the throughput that comes through in that.
Thank you, Donald. Tom, Graham, and then Richard.
Thank you. I think there's a problem that venison has always been historically sort of considered as a luxury product. I think we need to get our heads around that, and I would back those that have already suggested getting it into schools and hospitals in particular. That's something that MSPs and ministers should be able to help with. I think it's important we don't lose sight of the fact that it should be a quality product in terms of putting it out there. Food safety needs to be at a premium. I won't never forget one ADMG AGM, Food Standards Scotland, standing up and saying if there's an E. coli outbreak in venison, then it will be shut down overnight. So we need to ensure that there are quality controls out there. So Scottish quality wild venison should be encouraged. And at risk of hyping up Scottish venison too much. They do run on a shoestring, and more funding going to support Richard and Scottish venison would be extremely helpful. Our members have doubled the funding to Scottish venison this year. So that is supported largely by the industry. And whilst the Scottish Government were extremely generous during COVID and very helpful and towards the venison sector, I think continued support of Scottish venison and marketing would be very helpful.
Thank you. Graham.
Yes, I'm going back to Richard's points. For FLS, our net cost every year on deer management is 9.4 million. So it's not insignificant to add to the fact it's a cost activity. And of course, that doesn't account for all cost on impact on tree damage, etc., which we're going to spend a bit of time on this year to try and get a better understanding of what that bigger, probably much bigger cost is on replanting trees, etc. So there. But yeah, a few examples. We mentioned some already, but so in terms of ourselves, most of our venison goes to Highland Game, who are based at Dundee. That's done through a tender exercise. Very interesting operation. If you go there, it's not a game dealer, it's Christian Nissen, who's the managing director, describes it as food processing, and use every single piece of the carcass. A little promotion here, we can all do our bit. It includes sausages through the main supermarket chains. It's got our logo on there, so he's doing a lot of good work, and a very big player in Scotland. So you've got that end of the scale. He has got potential to grow. So as others have said, you need that, and you also need the community end. So you need the scale, and you need the community end. It's also involved, mentioned already, Cairngorms Connect. We do a hill to grill every year with our local people. We had 800 people turned up this year, which is pretty incredible. Going from a stag, a beast from the hill, the butchering, the whole process. So it's that sort of thing. And back to supply chain, that is sold very locally, and demand is outstripping supply, which is interesting. So I think, like many things, there's some really good examples around Scotland. I mentioned a couple there that we can take advantage of and say, why is that working? How can we support and encourage other similar initiatives across Scotland? So we have got some great examples. And then one is from England, mentioned about public sector procurement. In the NHS Darwin and Blackburn in Lancashire, they have worked with our counterparts Force England of venison going into hospitals there, and there's some really good promotion there. And my final one is in the Press and Journal last Saturday, front page around deer management, the value of venison through Cairngorms Connect, and talking through it's, as others have said, very healthy, it's really good, you're doing all this benefit for the environment. So there is some really good examples, and I think it'd be good to draw on those and expand some of that to make it more across Scotland.
Thank you. Yeah. Richard and Malcolm.
Yes, just to pick up a few points I didn't make earlier. I mean, and I think there are some green shoots, and they've been referred to, but it's still a fragile industry. And I would characterise it as a sort of two-tier industry where the main dealers that have been mentioned are supplying the multiple retailers and the wholesalers. So that's the sort of commodity end of the industry. But there is also a very clear demand for the local production of venison. And we've had 3 pilot schemes over the last, different from the ones we were talking about earlier. These are pilot larder schemes, community larder schemes, 2 of which are now operating, one which is just about to start operating, because the constant cry one hears, and I heard it from the last minister when we were having a venison meeting, is that I love venison, but I can't get it. Where do you get it? And she lived in Edinburgh. So if there's a problem, if there's a perceived problem about the market, then we have to address that. So the infrastructure and the outlet issue is one we're addressing. What we're going through really is a professionalisation process, and Scottish Venison, which has substantially raised its funding and needed to, and its aspirations and engagement with other organisations, is merging with the Quality Assurance Scheme. There's a lot of venison that's still produced that's not quality assured, but we're making progress on that because it needs to be able to compete with other red meat and other food products. The final thing well, 2 final things I'd say is, first of all, the recently passed Agriculture Act, due to pressure from the various organisations around this table, did include at second bill stage reference to venison production in terms of Scottish food output. So that was a really important step. And again, a small foot in the door. Finally, England. England is important because if you think there's a deer problem in Scotland, as some would say, you've only got to look south of the border. It's out of control in many areas. And there are pictures online on YouTube of thousands of fallow deer trampling across fields. They've got a real problem. They're miles behind where we are. They're also miles behind where we are in terms of thinking about the markets. But Forestry England is taking a lead on that. And this is important to us because we need to grow the market sufficiently, not only to take an increase in culling in Scotland, but also to take account of the much increased supply that is going to come from England and Wales.
Interesting. Malcolm.
Thank you. We've heard a couple of examples there. I'll offer a couple of anecdotes, if I may. My first is probably the only at-scale interaction I've had with venison in the urban lowlands, and that relates to the Gowgale Trust in Govan, which maybe someone from the SGA might be able to speak to as well, but it was to do with deer management near the M8, and they were able to use venison for their community meals and such like, which I think was a really interesting point, and if something like that could be spun out. Obviously there's going to be issues about getting it into the food chain, but I'll just mention that. And then my second, possibly not helpful, but a very random analogy. 2 years ago, I was down at a cricket test match between India and Australia at the Oval. All the burger stalls were venison because of the Indian community's attitude towards beef. So there's a market for you, perhaps. I'll just mention that and move on.
Thank you. I've got a supplementary from Beatrice, I think, and then questions from Elena.
Yeah, my question's about the... I understand that the Deer Working Group or the Scottish Government doesn't currently collate data on the number of deer which go to venison dealers. So is that information that would be beneficial to gather? And if so, what would be the best methods of gathering it?
Donald?
So, I mean, as it currently stands, there's a venison dealer licence that's required in there, and there are potentially reporting aspects of that can come through the current legislation. The issue that we have in collecting and managing that data is that it's understanding what is coming from the producer, so where it's being shot, and then it goes into a venison dealer licence environment. And then the requirements of that is that it's recorded all the way through that process in terms of where that carcass goes. So there are issues there in terms of the most effective way of gathering that information. And the current setup in terms of legislation isn't really fit for purpose in that and not an efficient way of doing that. Now, there might be benefits of that in terms of looking at that in terms of how that can be done. But probably venison dealer's licence, as they currently stand, is not the best way of doing that.
Okay, thank you. Ross?
Just a very brief point, Convener, and it's just to acknowledge that while a lot, probably the majority of beasts that are shot do go through a VDL of some form or another, there are obviously several people that do decide to take one for the pot, as it were, and process and eat venison themselves. I think it's important, if we're talking about data, to ensure that those don't get overlooked, because there are a number of people that do undertake that. And I think if we're talking about data collection more broadly, it's important that that's encapsulated as well, because people do consume one for the pot, and I think that's important to acknowledge.
Richard?
Just quickly on the venison dealer's licence, the consultation paper last year suggested that the venison dealer's licence might be suspended. I think Scottish Venison's view of that is not until there is an adequate system to replace it. Data is just so important, as we've already discussed, in understanding what we're dealing with in terms of deer management.
Anyone else on that point? No. Elena?
Thanks, Convener. I'm interested in exploring the impact of the evolving deer management on rural economies and jobs, but I'm also interested in exploring policy coherence and actually how we make sure that we read across I don't think that we always do that as effectively as what we should be doing. So even if we just take the example of discussing venison that we've just done, if we think about the community wealth building models, if we think about the anchor institutions, the local supply chains, the reducing of food miles, but we also think about alleviating food poverty. Malcolm, you gave a very good example there about community meals, etc. And if we think about local skills, if we think about community regeneration, but also community cohesion and actually making sure communities exist beyond the here and now into the future. So I'm thinking about those local skills, I'm thinking about traditional ways of life, etc. How can we ensure, as parliamentarians scrutinising policy coming through, in your estimation, that we get this right in terms of deer management and the rural economies that are linked to it, and the possibility of jobs in that space? So I know that's a lot to think about, but who wants to kick us off?
I'll start with Tom, then Richard, and Lee. Thank you. Tom.
There's a lot in that question.
Sorry.
I don't have to apologise. It's very pertinent. You know, there are real concerns out there in the rural sector about jobs. There are real concerns amongst deer managers about what the future holds, particularly in the short to medium term. You know, if we establish all this habitat that we aspire to, then the deer problem now will be a small problem compared to what it might be in the future. But in the short to medium term, a lot of deer managers in the Highlands are fearful about what enforced reductions in deer management might mean for their jobs. Those fears so far have not been allayed by anything that we've heard within the consultation. And I think when you combine that with other changes that are taking place in the rural sector, you know, those fears are sort of ratcheted up even further. And I'm sure Lee, through his work in the Common Ground Forum and with SGA, can talk about that much more eloquently than I can. But in terms of policy, it seems to us from the outside that things are managed in government in silos, and there's not enough conversation between those silos, and there needs to be more.
Lee.
Just say that's a very good question. I agree with everything you say. We've already referred to, Donald referred to the fact that we're shortly going to get the agricultural return requiring deer culls to be registered. I mean, that cooperation, which we've been pressing for years, has been urgently needed and will be hugely helpful. And as I also mentioned, venison getting into the agriculture bill was a huge step forward. So, long way to go, but we're pointing in the right direction.
Thank you. Lee and then Duncan.
Thank you. We reckon that if you reduce deer numbers down to 5 per square kilometre, you won't be able to have sustainable employment in the States. I don't think that would happen. There's grave concerns, as has been said earlier on, among the stocking fraternity. We've also got to look at community schools. If you've no jobs, you've no communities, the whole thing's gone. If there's no full-time jobs involved, you then have the scenario that you might have a contractor coming in to cover an area. So you've got the possibility of one contractor covering maybe 10 estates on a moving, rotational basis. And obviously nothing for the community. He's coming in, he'll shoot there and then he'll move on to somewhere else. And it just goes round in a circle. You've lost the jobs, you've lost the skills, which then somebody said earlier on, the indigenous folk, I don't know if we're allowed to call them indigenous or not, but I think we are indigenous. You lose everything, you lose all these things.
Thank you. Duncan and then Ross.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak from sort of the NGO land management perspective, but all I can say on generally across the NGO estate in Scotland, we're shooting more deer than we've ever done at more sites to reduce numbers, and even where, so for example, at RSPB Scotland's own site at Abernethy in the Cairngorms National Park. We have been at deer management there for over 20 years. We reduced numbers quite significantly. We're now part of the Cairngorms Connect project that Graham mentioned earlier. Last year, we took the highest deer cull we have ever taken on that ground. So, and this is, largely because there are still these huge populations out there, and we're getting deer incursions from neighbouring ground. So our experience in general is that we're employing more people to do deer stalking than we have ever done. And remember that, once you get deer populations down, you have to maintain those populations. So that in itself is creating jobs, and most of these jobs are in rural communities. So, we've heard already that, to get deer populations down from the current population of over a million animals, we have to have an enhanced cull of over 50,000 animals a year to get us on a downward population trajectory. To my reading, at least, that is going to mean more jobs in local communities. But what we do need is the people that are upskilled and trained and able to do those jobs.
I've got Ross and then Donald.
Thanks, Convener. I think I'll just pick up on Lee's point there. I don't think we should underestimate the importance of deer stalking when it comes to rural communities. Estates are increasingly diversified, but that should not nullify the extent to which deer stalking is a really important income stream for some estates as well. Just in terms of balancing the books, we've heard about how loss-making it can be, but it does still nevertheless provide income. The ability for an estate to have international visitors coming to Scotland to embark on country sports tourism and deer stalking is something that is important for the rural economy more broadly. They generally spend quite a lot of money in hotels, restaurants, gunsmiths and so on, and I think that is a really important point. The other thing I wanted to highlight is new entrants coming into the sector as well. We are experiencing a significant kind of lack of new people, professional wildlife managers kind of coming into the sector. There's been a game and wildlife management skills group set up which will meet for the first time next week with support from Lantra, which is fantastic. But it is something I think we're starting to see, some of the political pressures that have been described today starting to have an impact on the ability of people actually to come into the sector. It's not as maybe appealing as maybe it once was, and I do think that's something we need to be cognizant of. And the final point just around kind of joined up policy. Again, I come back to this point around kind of carrot and stick, and obviously totally respect the Scottish Government's intention to achieve nature restoration and nature recovery, but deer management alone will not achieve that. We need to have a joined up approach that looks at all herbivore impacts, not deer in isolation, and unfortunately this coming legislation looks and feels like it's going to deal with deer in isolation, which is one part of an increasingly complex jigsaw.
Okay, thank you. I've got Donald, David, and then Graham.
Yeah, so just to pick up in the kind of policy cohesion point, and obviously we're a government agency, so just, and I mentioned earlier on the kind of strategic deer board that had been formed to kind of oversee the work, and I think that really has brought, in my experience, brought the kind of public policy areas together in better understanding and not treating species-specific deer in a silo, and we are looking at that in the wider context around agricultural, forestry, the national parks that are involved in it too. So that has brought that to that table, and that we're not looking at in terms of whether it's Scottish biodiversity strategy or land reform or the other aspects that are taken forward. But I think there's a recognition that there's a lot happening in the kind of rural sector in terms of transitional land use, obviously on the climate and biodiversity priorities. But I think that cohesion is happening around that and the understanding there, obviously making the links into the plethora of areas that deer actually fit is really a challenge, but it's where we want to be in terms of making sure there is a more holistic look to deer management and it's not seen in isolation. And I think that just on the jobs front, I think that is important in the context of the discussion that we're having around incentives as well, in that we want to support jobs, people on the ground who are actually doing it, and the nature of that incentives or support that's going in there needs to make sure that it filters down into that kind of employment place, so that we do support rural communities or the rural economy in that way. So making sure that the support that is given is targeted in such a way that it does filter down and provide that support. But the point has been made that quite a lot of the focus has been on reducing deer numbers, and that does come at a cost, but there's more return from that. The challenge that we have is where there are low deer numbers, and maintaining and sustaining that in the long term, because the return is not there, but the effort that is required is as much, if not more, to make sure that we continue that. So that's where some of the challenges in getting that income streams, getting that support there, not just public support, but the wider kind of green economy type money that's coming through to make sure that we can deliver on that.
I'm very conscious of time, but conscious that there's a number of people who want to come in and respond to some comments that have been made. So forgive me if I'm going to jump around a bit, but I think Tom wanted to respond to a comment you made, Donald, and then Tim's got a supplementary.
I just wanted to mention the Strategic Deer Board. There's been little interaction between the industry and Strategic Deer Board directly, and I think it would be useful to have perhaps some representatives of deer management on the Strategic Deer Board, and I think it would be useful to have a little bit more transparency about what happens within the meetings.
Thank you. Tim, relating to jobs.
Well, Tom's just beat me to it. No, it was actually on the Deer Management Strategic Board, because Tom and Duncan turned and smiled to each other when that was mentioned, and I wasn't sure what that, because you obviously sit on that, Donald, but it is only government agencies that sit on that board. So just briefly, for clarity then, and Tom's point, how is that flow of information from practitioner level to that strategic level of discussion?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, the board is there to make sure that the Deer Working Group recommendations are delivered, and the action plan, which is, what we mentioned earlier on, is the NatureScot website in terms of the openness and transparency of the work that is being delivered under that. I mean, the reporting mechanism is through the Deer Management Round Table, but we also meet with Tom and with Duncan after every Strategic Deer Board meeting as the kind of key organisations who've got an interest in the work that's been developed through that. So it is a public agency forum board that's there to kind of manage and oversee the work that's done across that. But we do, I take the point in terms of, and I'm sure the Strategic Deer Board will take the point in terms of making sure that there's that openness and transparency there.
Briefly, Duncan, on the agency.
On the same page as Tom here. The Strategic Deer Board, the updates are helpful, but it's not the same as being in the room. And, the minutes, frankly, need to be significantly improved. I mean, the minutes from the meetings, you can tell little or nothing from them as to what's going on. So a plea from me, can we get better minutes, and please can we be a bit more involved, along with Tom. Agree.
Thank you. I've got David and then Graham.
Thanks. On the economics, I guess just digging into a little bit the kind of viability of the current system, I think stats would suggest that 80% of current culling is carried out at a net loss. So notwithstanding any action we're going to take to reduce deer numbers, there's a question for me whether the current system is kind of economically viable and giving communities the returns they might expect. And I guess for me, a bit of a risk that we're getting into a slightly kind of polarised debate of either the existing kind of system or nothing. And I think, Ross, you mentioned the key word, which is around diversification. So, there is scope for elements of the existing model to continue to evolve as they have done for the past 200 years, alongside, future changes to that role. And there's plenty of space for that. Sport shooting can require up to 330 hectares for one job, agriculture 183, forestry 42, horticulture only 3. So, there's plenty of scope within our land holdings to have that kind of diversified palette of outcomes that's going to generate that much more sustainable economic impact for communities, as well as preserving some of the elements of the traditional model that I think we've all talked about.
Graham.
Yeah, just 2 quick points. I agree with what's been said a lot, so I'll not add just a couple of extra ones. So in terms of jobs and that earlier point about bringing the deer numbers down, lower deer densities, concern about less jobs, from our own experience, obviously it gets harder to cull, so actually you need more people, if anything. So our experience is we use our own direct staff and contractors, and we see no sign of that reducing in terms of what we need to achieve the cull, including in areas of lower deer densities. So I think actually the issue is the other way around. It's actually how we bring people into the industry, and we need more people stalking, has been mentioned. So a good example we've got is that we took on apprentices as wildlife rangers, go stalking. I've had a lot of interest in that, so a lot of applications, good people coming in. Only did that in the last 2 years, so quite encouraged that we're getting local people interested in going into a career in deer stalking. So there's some green shoots there, Chairman.
Thank you. Briefly, Tom.
Brief. As soon as you reduce those deer numbers down below a certain level, there's less income coming in, be it through venison, which we've already discussed is very low, or the alternative, which is sporting. So covering those costs become increasingly difficult as well for most estates.
Thank you. I've got a supplement from Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. As I'm just thinking about what Malcolm said earlier about govern, and Lee mentioned urban as well. So deer management isn't it just rural or highlands or lowlands, it's peri-urban as well. But also the challenges of the jobs or the skills required in an urban area if you're going to cull deer. So that's is that a concern? Do you need extra skills or a higher level of skill in order to cull deer in an urban area?
Yeah, we have woodlands in Glasgow, including right in the centre of Glasgow, Cunnagar Loop beside the Celtic Park, etc. So we've got experience of doing deer culling in very, very urban settings. And what we do, we liaise with the police, given the safety concerns around it. So there is more required. It's, and we have staff with particular expertise, so a lot of stakeholder engagement, a lot of working with others to be able to do deer stalking in an urban environment. Absolutely. Thank you.
I think on this point, Donald.
Just briefly, I mean, I think the principles are the same in terms of we want to make sure that deer management is carried out safely, humanely, to best practice, with welfare standards all adapted in that. Clearly, there are more challenges in that environment where there are more people around. They kind of make sure there's appropriate risk assessments around that. But the key bit is about, I think, more about communications and making sure people understand the need for deer management, the benefit that brings, and they need to do it in these circumstances. You're right, it's not just a rural. Deer are across Scotland, inner cities, in our urban environments, and they need to manage, not just from an environmental point of view, but from a road safety point of view, public safety point of view in there as well. There's a number of reasons of why we have to manage deer in Scotland, and that's communicated effectively. That is a challenge in a, big urban environment to get that message across.
Okay, the couple of questions at the end. One I'm going to direct probably at Richard and then at Malcolm. Is there a scope to look at potentially getting rid of the venison dealer licence and consider a licensing scheme for trained hunters, which could get some of the more difficult to reach venison onto the market and potentially open up an income stream for some of the hunters to make it a little bit more incentivised?
I think, as I said earlier, the present system is clunky and could be better. But we need a transition that doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so that we could move to a system such as you refer to, but we need more information, as I've said several times already, about the hunters, who they are, where they're operating, all of that, before we move to another system that is better.
Okay. That's helpful. Malcolm, I know you've signalled to come in. I've got a question for you. So you acted as advisor on the Deer Working Group report. Earlier, goodness, it's back in 2023, this committee did one of the things that doesn't normally happen. We actually annulled an SSI. I think we're the first SSI to be annulled in the Parliament on changes to the male close season and amendments to the Firearms Act. Do you believe that these changes will eventually make significant changes to deer densities in Scotland?
That's something I'm not qualified to answer, I'm afraid. So sorry to immediately dodge it.
Well, maybe I'll maybe open that up before I come back to you. Is there anybody else got any comments on those SSIs? I'm going to go to Tom and then Duncan and Donald.
I think the people who were using authorisations in the previous system to shoot male deer will do that now, continue to do so. I think that I should also raise that I think the consultation around those changes was disappointing as well with the sector, and it was very hurried. But no, I don't think it will make a difference, if I'm honest with you. People can shoot under authorisation if they need to.
Okay, Duncan and then Donald.
Yeah, so starting with the firearms, as I mentioned earlier, one of the main provisions there was to facilitate the use of non-lead ammunition. We need to move in that direction. So, yes, I think that's been a good move, and we need to see more use of non-lead ammunition for all the reasons around healthy food products that we talked about earlier. On the male deer seasons, yes, we think that has been helpful, mainly because, as we've been discussing, I think we need more flexibility within the deer management system to allow those that want to cull deer at different times of the year. I mean, with male deer, there is no particular welfare issue there, provided you meet the standards that Donald outlined, which we all do. We have accredited people who shoot the deer. That allows us that flexibility to do that if we choose to do it. Some people may not want to cull male deer, what they perceive out of season. That latitude is still there not to do that.
Okay, Donald.
Just briefly on the 3 points. To the first one around night shooting sighting devices, I mean, it's basically making sure that we're keeping up with technology and use, and we're putting barriers in place to effective control. So, having done the due diligence in terms of making sure there weren't welfare issues and the standards around that, then that was the reason for taking that forward. The second piece, as Duncan has alluded to, was making sure that the firearms order was in line with the availability of ammunition which could be provided in a non-lead variety. Again, without making sure that there are no welfare issues associated with that. So that, those were 2 pieces. The male deer close season, really, I mean, the proof will be in the pudding in terms of the data that comes back on that and understanding what the effect of that has been. But I mean, again, it's removing barriers to effective control and making, we've gone through the process, there isn't a welfare issue associated around that, and on that basis, from a regulation and effective governance perspective, there's no reason to maintain that.
Okay, thank you. Very finally, hot off the press, the government has said it's now not going to make changes to the female close season. What are your views on that in relation to the recommendations that came out in the Deer Working Group? Any comments on that? Duncan.
Yeah, so going back to the point that Donald's just made, we do need more flexibility in the deer management system to allow effective culling. Certainly when it comes to the female deer season, everybody accepts there is a welfare issue here, but I think our position and the Linked Deer Group is that we think any consideration around female deer season should be based on hard evidence, using all the scientific data available, the advice of the Animal Welfare Commission as to when it is sensible to have the female deer seasons without compromising deer welfare. I think this will probably come back as an issue because this announcement has been made, we think, prematurely. It is a pertinent conversation that needs to be had during the next steps of the NE bill.
And then Tom.
Thanks, Convener. This is a really difficult issue. I think it's really important, though, that we acknowledge that what we're potentially asking some deer stalkers to do is potentially quite unpalatable, is probably a nice way to put it. And I do think we need to be cognizant of their views and their feelings and the potential implications on their mental health as a result of doing what they could have been asked to do. So from our perspective, I think we probably welcome the Minister's announcement on this. That being said, for people that do want flexibility when it comes to managing female deer out of the close season, there is still a mechanism that they can do that through authorisation from Nature Scott. So that ability is still there for those circumstances where that is required, and that has not gone away. So I actually think the Minister has probably, on balance, done the right thing here, and I think he's listened to concerns which were headed fully by my colleagues at the Scottish Gamekeepers Association, who really did a blinder in terms of highlighting the potential implications on this issue.
Thank you. Tom.
Yeah, I think we should welcome the decision. It is an emotive subject, and views are split amongst deer managers, whatever your background, and you can put 10 deer managers in a room and you might have 10 different views on it. But it is extremely emotive, and I think it should be welcomed. And as Ross has already alluded to, you can continue to shoot deer at that time of year under authorisation.
Yeah, just very quickly agree with what's been said there, that welfare's first. Second part is the individual stalker's got to give room to make a judgment, and every situation is different. And as Ross has said, there is the authorisation system there, so we're comfortable with that.
Thank you. And David.
Thanks. I agree with Duncan. I think it'd be good to see this potentially come back as a topic that the committee revisits. There's science and evidence here around the welfare impact, and we've talked about a requirement to reduce deer numbers. If we're going to significantly reduce deer numbers, then that means reducing the female population.
Thank you. I think that completes our questioning this morning. So thank you very much for your contributions. You'll be pleased to hear that there's no doubt we will see you around this table again in not too distant future. But that certainly sets out some of the groundwork that we're going to have to do as a committee with the Natural Environment Bills finally introduced. So that concludes our proceedings in public. We will now move into private session and I suspend this meeting for 10 minutes.